Alright guys, so this is a big one. De-dollarization is going to accelerate even further and no one's really talking about it. Saudi Arabia is moving to join the BRICS Bank. They are looking to move away from the Western financial system, and this is big news because the country in question is Saudi Arabia. Everything is leading up to the kingdom joining the BRICS bloc for real, and this of course is destabilizing for the dollar and another blow to the US hegemony. Now, what we are seeing is a shift towards a multipolar financial system. And ever since the Russian sanctions, there's been a breakdown in trust and it's bad news after bad news for the West. And what we are witnessing is a great reshuffling of the world order. And in our lead story today, Saudi Arabia is in talks to join the China-based BRICS Bank. And this is a move that will strengthen the bloc's funding options. It is a move to build another global bank that can project independent power. And according to the FT, the addition of the kingdom would reinforce ties between the bank, which was established by the world's biggest developing economies, as an alternative to Western-led Bretton Woods institutions and the world's second largest oil producer. This is Saudi Arabia essentially doing a test drive by joining a major institutions of the BRICS nations. They are laying the groundwork before officially becoming a full member of the bloc. We need to understand this. And remember how close we are to the 2023 BRICS Summit. Something big is likely going to go down in August. It's just a few months away. There are 19 nations expressing interest to join the group, but I want us to focus on the big game changers who are applying. We are talking about Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE, big oil producers that can swing the pendulum of power towards the BRICS nations. We have said many times here that we are going to see a big battle between commodity producers and money printers, and should be quite obvious which is more valuable. And this is how much power these three oil producers have. Collectively, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE contribute to over 20% of global oil production. That's more than the United States, which stands at 18.5%. Plus, we haven't even added in China, Russia, or Brazil yet. And that's why the Saudis joining the BRICS Bank is a big deal. It is a move that will strengthen the emerging economies and give the global south a fighting chance to break away from the dollar system. And if you're Saudi Arabia, you know that the world is changing and you have to make friends with a rising power, right? The G7 is in decline compared to the BRICS nations. Just take a look at this shocking chart. The BRICS bloc is an economic giant. Just in 2021 alone, they account for 25% of absolute global GDP and 20% of the world's market cap. That is some incredible economic leverage that we can't ignore. In fact, in certain measures, the BRICS have already overtaken the G7 nations since 2020 in terms of GDP contribution. Just observe the trajectory, guys. One bloc is heading up and growing strong, while the other is in decline. So it's no surprise that Saudi Arabia is moving to join BRICS. But why join the BRICS Bank? What advantage can they get? And it's really simple. Diversify their funding options outside of the US dollar. Every country today borrows money by issuing bonds to investors, and a ton of them are denominated in the reserve currency. And if you fall on the backside of the United States, the dollar could always get weaponized against you. And this means either you get locked out of the SWIFT system and your dollars are as good as hot potatoes, or they could block your bond payments if they were issued through American banks. And let's flash back to April 2022. As part of the sanctions against Russia, the United States targeted the Russian bond market. They stopped Russia from making bond payments, and this caused their sovereign bonds to crash in value to almost 20 cents on the dollar. It even went below that. Just look at the collapse that happened once the sanctions were imposed. Investors were worried that Russia would default. The United States blocked Russia from using their dollars stored in American banks to pay back the bondholders. Putin couldn't use US banks to transfer payments anymore, and this pushed Russia to default on its debt for the first time since 1918. And let's get this clear, Russia had the dollars to pay bondholders, but they couldn't access it. So this was indeed a technical default because they failed to pay their obligations in US dollars. And this is why Saudi Arabia wants to join the BRICS Bank. They want to have more options when it comes to writing loans. Because when you default, no matter the reason, you will spook out investors. The market and ratings agencies will downgrade your bonds, and this will increase your borrowing costs. So if your bonds were at 5% yield before, now you have to borrow at 7, 8, or even 10% or more. But if the Saudis issue bonds through the BRICS Bank, they will bypass the Western financial system. Now, the BRICS Bank, which is also called the New Development Bank, recently issued a 8.5 billion yuan bond for investors. And here's the important part. It was issued to China's interbond market and underwritten by the Bank of China. It isn't issued by American bank and it isn't denominated in dollars. So it is a good move for the Saudis to join. They can start issuing bonds outside of the dollar and better access the Chinese markets as well. The BRICS Bank is centered in Shanghai, so it's away from Western influence. And one reason why it's so hard to de-dollarize the world is because of the global debt markets. Countries, they issue a ton of debt denominated in dollars, so there's a constant demand for the reserve currency. And that's why even if the United States defaults today, the knee-jerk reaction will be a stronger dollar. Countries will still have to pay back their dollar obligations, so they will rush to buy dollars and depreciate their own local currencies in the process. And that's why the Saudis joining the BRICS Bank could be the start of a global bond market shifting away from dollars. At the very least, it's diversifying towards a multipolar system. But let's take this one step further because it gets really interesting how the BRICS Bank can shift global reliance away from the dollar. And according to Russia, they view the bank as an instrument to help alleviate the impact of Western sanctions and move away from oil sales pegged to the dollar. So let's go through pricing oil sales away from the dollar. This is important. We know that Saudi Arabia and China have been talking about pricing oil in yuan. It has been going on for many years now, even decades. But the reason why it hasn't happened goes beyond just pissing off the United States. That's the obvious blowback. Now, the big reason is where can they invest all their excess yuan? If the Saudis sell their oil for the Chinese currency, they will definitely have excess. They need outlets to reinvest that money back to earn a return. And we can see that the US bond market is $25 trillion strong, while China is only around 8 to 9 to maybe $10 trillion in size. And that's why the world still prefers dollars. The treasury market can absorb more investment money than the Chinese bond market. This is another reason why the majority of global trade is done in dollars, because there are more outlets to invest in. The US capital markets are deeper, so it's a vicious cycle. Now, the BRICS Bank plays an important role in moving global trade away from the dollar, especially if Saudi Arabia joins. And in order to join the BRICS Bank, you will need to be a shareholder. Now, the bank has a total of $100 billion of shares, and each of the BRICS countries have ponied up $10 billion each. There is an unallocated pool of $47 billion. So if Saudi Arabia joins, they will start to fund the activities of the BRICS Bank. And we know Saudi Arabia has a ton of money thanks to their oil sales. And this will allow the bank to mobilize more money for the BRICS nations to give loans to the rest of the world. And this is where things get really interesting. And by now, we've probably heard 1,000 times of a common BRICS currency. We have believers who say it could shake the dollar's dominance, that it will change the financial world order. Then you have skeptics who say a BRICS currency is a flawed idea and it will crash and burn. And we won't know for sure until it comes out. But we are fast approaching that reality if Saudi Arabia joins the fold. And you see, in order for a BRICS common currency to materialize, there will have to be some backing of sorts. We know the US dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, right? Which is a fancy way of saying nothing. So the BRICS currency can't possibly just be backed by only faith and credit as well. There's no differentiating factor that will push countries to switch away in a big manner. There's no incentive for countries to abandon the dollar because it is the establishment. We are just too used to it. And that's why gold is a good option to back the currency, but maybe oil could be even better because oil is a commodity that the whole world needs, especially the emerging economies. By joining BRICS, Saudi Arabia will throw a wrench into the petrodollar system. If the Saudis join the BRICS bloc, we will have a bloc that controls a huge portion of the global oil markets. Between the Saudis, Russia, China, and Brazil, we are talking about over 30% of global production. And this number shoots up to almost 45% if we add in other BRICS applicants like Iraq and Iran. And this is not insignificant. If you control the majority of oil production in the world, you have pricing power. But wait till you see the next chart because it completes the picture of why a BRICS currency might be possible, or at least pricing oil away from the dollar is not a myth. And according to the EIA, the biggest consumer of oil is the United States. coming in at 21%. America represents over a fifth of the world's oil demand, and that is a lot. However, if we group the BRICS nations together, the story changes quite a bit. In the top 10 list, we have China, India, Russia, and Brazil, and let's throw in Saudi Arabia as well. In total, they account for 30% of global oil demand, and that is on par with the G7 nations on this list. So as an economic bloc, BRICS now has huge bargaining power when it comes to both the production and consumption of oil, the world's most valuable commodity. So just imagine if you're BRICS with the majority of the world's production and you control a huge part of energy demand as well. You get to start dictating the terms of how you sell your oil, right? Maybe you want to buy or sell energy in Saudi Riyal or maybe even in a new currency. Suddenly, you call the shots. And this is why France and China settled historic LNG trade, pricing it in the Chinese yuan. It involves 65,000 tons of LNG imported from the UAE. And why did France do it? Because China probably gave them better terms and they could profit more by settling in the Chinese yuan. And if the BRICS nations have enough pricing power, they can start selling or buying other commodities away from the dollar. Now, I'm not saying that the BRICS Bank will change the world tomorrow or become the next World Bank. What's more likely is the shift towards multiple regions of power, a multipolar financial system. And honestly, this is a good thing because now countries can choose who to get funding from. If they trust the dollar system, they can go to the Western banks, the Western markets, and issue bonds there. Now, if they want an alternative outlet, they can head to the BRICS Bank to raise money there. And that's why Saudi Arabia becoming a member is such a big deal. They add more funding, they add more credibility, and most importantly, they add energy into the mix. But I want to talk about a lesser known strategy about how the BRICS Bank can break reliance on the dollar even further. And I think by now we know the basics of global trade. If you want to buy commodities like oil, wheat, or sugar, you need to use dollars. The Federal Reserve has a very important chart that tells us how central the dollar is to global trade. Even in Asia and the rest of the world, the dollar accounts for over 70% of export invoicing. And this means 7 out of 10 times you'll be transacting in the reserve currency, whether you like it or not. This becomes a problem when the Fed raises interest rates and money flows away from local currencies to the dollar. Nations will still need to buy dollars even though they become more expensive. There's no choice because they need to import goods and commodities. However, it creates a currency crisis for countries, especially in the emerging markets. And this is where the BRICS Bank comes in. If the BRICS Bank has enough liquidity, it can provide swap lines to these emerging markets. It allows emerging economies to swap their own local currency for liquidity from the BRICS Bank. And this can come in the form of the Chinese yuan or even a new BRICS currency. These emerging markets can then use these new currencies to buy out commodities from the bloc, whether those are base metals, oil and gas, or wheat and corn. It is an alternative market price outside of the dollar, and this is feasible because there's a big gap in the market when it comes to swap lines. Basically, the Federal Reserve only provides liquidity to a select group of countries, and in this chart, we can see the countries with swap lines from the Federal Reserve. This allows them to access a huge amount of dollar liquidity to pay for stuff. And we can see that it comprises mainly of the G7 nations, including the EU and Switzerland. Many of the emerging markets aren't on this list. So if there's a currency crisis, they have to drain away their dollar reserves for trade or depreciate their own local currency to buy dollars. And this is a big funding gap that the BRICS Bank can feel. Now, what we are witnessing is the start of a serious power shift, guys. I'm not saying that the dollar will disappear tomorrow. This shift could very well take years or even decades to manifest, but it's yet another blow to the reserve currency. Even BlackRock is getting concerned about this death by 1,000 cuts. Pulling up a story from Insider, the BlackRock bond chief is telling the world that we keep chipping away at the dollar's armor. He still believes in the dollar as the reserve currency, but he's well aware of the de-dollarization as well. And listen to this, alternative assets eating away at the dollar's lead, including assets like the Chinese yuan, the euro, crypto, and gold. Saudi Arabia joining the BRICS Bank by itself won't collapse the dollar, but it could open the door to more countries de-dollarizing even faster. Now, the biggest challenge the BRICS nations have is accumulating enough critical mass to challenge the existing order, the established order. And this means getting more members that produce commodities into the group. And if Saudi Arabia joins the bloc, that will be a game changer. So let me know what you think. Will Saudi Arabia join the BRICS Bank? But more importantly, Will they become an official BRICS nation come August? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.